Welcome to the Holistic Living Podcast, my beautiful friends. You can expect my uncensored, real, and honest thoughts on a wide variety of health topics. If you love to learn on ways to improve your health, your life, your mindset, your emotions, and everything in between in a natural way, you are in the right place, and I am so excited to have you here. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 13 of the Holistic Living Podcast. Today, we are talking about lectins. I'm going to go over everything you need to know about them. If you have any kind of skin issue, inflammatory condition, autoimmune condition, I am sure by now you've heard about lectins and a lot of different health gurus on social media, on YouTube, talking about lectins. So most of you are most likely familiar with them, but I am going to break down what they are. We're also going to talk about how they work, how they affect the body, different foods that contain lectins, the best way to prepare lectin foods, whether or not we should be eating them at all, and so much more. So I hope you enjoy. This is a very important topic for me because majority of my clients at some point within their health journey are not able to tolerate lectin foods. And so this is something I want to educate on a little bit more. So yeah, I hope you enjoy. So just to jump in, you've probably heard all kinds of opinions around lectins and lectin-containing foods. I've heard some practitioners say, do not consume any foods that contain lectins. I'll hear some say lectins are not harmful. And then, of course, in the middle as well. So I'm going to share with you as much research-based information that I can, and then hopefully you guys can kind of take this information and run with it however you feel is best for you. So you probably have heard that lectins can have some unfavorable side effects, can cause some health concerns. This podcast mainly is just intended to give you more insight into lectins, what they are, who should or shouldn't consume them, but I'm not trying to give you 100% information. I should say not information, but 100% opinion. That's something you should form on your own, as everybody is different and unique. All right, so let's just dive in. Like I said, there are a lot of lectin-free diets becoming more and more popular as more people are led to believe that lectins are bad. Lectins are present actually within our body, as well as a vast array of foods, and can have different impacts on our health depending on the individual and whether or not lectins are created internally in the body or taken in from food. The processing of lectins in foods also can affect us in a variety of ways. So what are lectins? Lectins are actually a type of protein that binds to carbs and is found in both animals and plants. And because of their ability to bind to carbs, they can be involved in many processes throughout the body, inflammatory and anti-inflammatory alike. They are also involved in binding of cells and viruses to a target tissue and many other actions as well. While some actions of lectins can be quite inflammatory and toxic in the body, others can actually have positive benefits. Lectins are found within the human body and, like I said, perform a variety of tasks that aid in the function of our system. So some lectins, such as the ones found in legumes, can be quite toxic due to their ability to trigger inflammation. Raw plants will also contain toxic lectins that are known as quote-unquote anti-nutrients, which will also reduce the body's ability to assimilate proteins, carbs, and essential minerals. So for example, if you are consuming a food that contains lectins, which are like those anti-nutrients, and you eat them with other foods, they will prevent the nutrient assimilation and absorption of the vitamins and minerals in that food. They can also cause red blood cells to clump together, which reduces oxygen delivery to our cells, and therefore they have the potential to clog the arteries. Lectins can also cause allergic reactions and can also trigger food sensitivity development. Because of their inflammatory effects, they can have the ability to trigger autoimmune flares or reactions as well. So certain families of foods contain lectins, which are also called phytohemagglutinins, and they are proteins that bind to carbs, like I mentioned earlier. So that's essentially what a lectin is. It's just a protein, it binds to carbs, and then however it behaves after that depends on where the lectin is coming from and the type of lectin that it is. So this is really important, this next point here. Agglutination occurs when there is a clumping reaction that gets triggered by consuming lectins. So you know how we kind of said that they like make red blood cells clump together? They also make other things clump together as well. So just to move on, but continue on this point, kidney beans are high in those phytohemagglutinins, or PHA. And PHA are actually used in labs to get T cells activated. Before I continue, PHA is a T cell mitogen. What this means, and specifically T cells, for those of you who don't know, I feel like many of you are familiar with T cells by this point because it's all I talk about with autoimmune, but T cells are just immune cells in our body that will then differentiate and form like Th1 cells, Th2 cells, Th17, etc. So they are like the main immune cells, which will then go on and secrete different cytokines depending on what the body needs. And so those PHAs, those phytohemagglutinins that are found in kidney beans, for example, will activate T cell production. Now, before I even continue further, I made a post, a video, as well as some blogs as well, going into different legumes and foods that target different parts of the body depending on what autoimmune condition you have. Kidney beans were like the highest food to avoid for almost every autoimmune condition you could possibly have. They were the most aggravating and the most irritating of all the different foods. So out of like peanuts and mushrooms and potatoes and all the other foods that typically could make you flare with an autoimmune, kidney beans were typically at the highest, and this was found through multiple studies. The reason why kidney beans were the highest for flare-ups was specifically because of this PHA, this phytohemagglutinins. It creates more T cell activation. And if your body is stuck in like a Th2 dominant state and all the T cells you're producing are turning into Th2 cells, you want to be careful with activating too much T cell production because you're just going to make yourself more inflamed because you're producing way more Th2 cells, which are releasing a lot more of those inflammatory cytokines. So I know I don't want this to get too complicated in terms of immunology, but that's just why we are always saying be careful with like certain nightshades, be careful with eating mushrooms at certain points, or in this case, kidney beans or certain legumes, because they have that ability or capacity to increase inflammation and therefore the autoimmune flare. And the reason why they create the autoimmune flare is through that T cell activation. So moving on, if you see a stimulated cytokine panel, so if you have like some blood work done and they say, okay, you have elevated cytokines, the stimulation of T cells, which produce the cytokines, is done by that PHA. B cells, so not T cells, but B cells are stimulated by endotoxins called lipopolysaccharides, which are B cell mitogens, and they are present on the lipid membranes of gram-negative bacteria. Okay, so moving on, hopefully you're still with me and not feeling super either bored or overwhelmed with this information, but I promise it's going to be worth it to stick through to the end. So which foods contain lectins? There are a lot of lectin-containing foods, and it's not possible for me to list them in their entirety here, but I will list the most common ones that people consume and hope that it suffices. If you are looking for an all-inclusive list, you can easily find them on Google. There's so many. But I'm going to go through the most common ones here. And again, this is typically when I'm working with my autoimmune clients, which is pretty much everyone I work with has autoimmune or at least an autoinflammatory condition. I'm always such like a big advocator on removing certain foods for a period of time. And I'll go through more information on that shortly. But when someone is in such an inflamed state, when the body is in this activation of inflammation and there's just this inflammatory loop going on in the system, you want to break that inflammation in every way possible. So of course I tell them you need to have better drinking water, get a better filter. I always will tell them manage your stress, do transcutaneous vagal nerve stimulation, go to bed at a better time, remove alcohol and things like that. And then, of course, you also want to look at food. Food is something that we are putting into our bodies 24/7 for the most part. Most of us are eating pretty late into the night, early when we wake up. So food's going into our body almost constantly, and therefore we could have a constant inflammatory reaction from food alone just because it is something we are putting into our system constantly. So it is important to remove certain foods, and some of the common foods are like those foods we know will elicit inflammation, whether they are lectin based or not. Peanuts, certain legumes, certain nuts in general, we always want to be very careful with. So the information that I'm about to share with you, even if you're like, okay, I should not be eating these foods, it's not to say you can never have these foods that I'm about to list and go into detail on. It's just sometimes beneficial to remove certain foods, especially high lectin foods, for a period of time until you can really get your inflammation under control, regulate the system more, kind of get back into that homeostasis. And then once you've gotten to that point, then usually reintroducing certain foods can be really helpful. Now, one last little tangent before I go into the foods that contain lectins, I want to use myself as an example and just share a really quick story with you guys, because this is something I get asked about all the time. So for those of you who are new here and who are unfamiliar, I had and have technically psoriasis, PCOS, eczema, IBS, so a lot of different autoinflammatory conditions, but psoriasis being the dominant one. And it was something I suffered with for years, full body coverage, head to toe and rashes and all that stuff. And for a long time, I could not touch nightshades or any lectin foods or like legumes, grains, anything like that. And so I had to cut it all out. But once I got my body into remission, I cleared my skin, I regulated my hormones, I cleaned out the gut and all of that stuff and felt great and still do feel great. I was then able to reintroduce certain foods. And so sometimes I share what I'm eating in a day through my Instagram or through my YouTube channel. And I always will get remarks and comments from people saying, if you have autoimmune, why are you eating certain legumes or why are you eating those grains? And the simple answer is my body tolerates it so much more now. We all have a threshold of inflammation, so much, our body can handle so much inflammation. And then eventually if we exceed that threshold or pass it, that's when our body starts to have symptoms or gets out of control. And so I know my threshold. And for me, I absolutely can enjoy lectin containing foods quite often, quite regularly. And my body handles it well because I'm less inflamed overall. So there's that little bit of wiggle room for inflammation before things kind of go nuts. And so that's just like a happy story I wanted to share, because I'm at a point now where I pretty much eat everything and I can have, no issues from it. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel. If you're going through this podcast and you're feeling like, shoot, I need to start cutting out all of these things I'm eating constantly because of the reaction I'm having from them, it's probably not forever. There's a good chance once you remove them for a good period of time, you can reintroduce them. So I hope that helps, but let's circle back. So some of the main foods that contain lectins would be wheat. So any wheat strain as well. So it's not just like your typical wheat, but anything that has like even the ancient wheats. So wheat, grains like rice, millet, quinoa, even though quinoa is technically a seed, we still call it grain. So any grains really, but rice, millet, quinoa, those are some of the common ones. Dairy, believe it or not, actually has lectins. Nuts are very high in lectins, especially like those almonds and like peanuts. Seeds, so even flax and chia seeds are high in lectins. And then of course you have the legumes. Legumes like that have a high concentration of lectins would be kidney beans, soybeans, black beans, pinto beans. All of them do have lectins, but kidney beans, soybeans, those are like the higher concentration of lectins, so should be avoided for a period of time for certain people, to clarify. But research shows that these foods, these lectin-containing foods, are linked to food poisoning, anemia. They prevent that iron absorption, jaundice, digestive distress, protein and carb malabsorption, and allergies, and autoimmune flares. Research also shows that lectins from beans can cause autoimmune and allergic reactions in the body due to the gastrointestinal lining damage that occurs from consuming certain lectins. So again, this is just a small list. There's a lot more foods. I kind of shared, instead of listing individual foods, more like categories. So like I said, wheats and grains, nuts, dairy, seeds, legumes. So those are more categories, but within that, almost everything that falls into those categories would contain some form of lectins, and some more than others. Again, you can find a full list on Google. If you just Google lectin-containing food list, you'll find a full list, and it usually will list it from the highest lectin-containing foods to the lowest. So hopefully that's helpful. But now that you know some of the high lectin foods as well as their negative side effects, I want to just go into a little bit of the positive things. So mainly the negative issue with lectins is the fact that they will bind to carbs and then prevent any absorption of nutrients into the bloodstream. So if you were eating lectins with like a healthy salad, you're probably not absorbing a ton of the nutrients in that salad because the lectins will prevent the absorption and binding of these nutrients into the body. They also can cause that red blood cell clumping to minimize oxygenation throughout the system. So it can really cause a lot of stagnation and poor circulation and all kinds of issues if you consume them regularly. They can cause autoimmune flares because of their ability to cause T cell or trigger T cell activation. So there's a lot of those side effects. They also can inflame the gut lining, so it can cause leaky gut and then more inflammation in the gut in general, which can irritate things like IBS, skin issues, etc. So those are some of the negatives. These negative effects from lectin consumption are not usually as much of an issue when the foods are cooked and prepared properly. And also to note, certain lectins have been proven to have health benefits, such as high antioxidant content and even anti-cancerous effects. So there's good and bad to them. So it's not just all bad. Kidney beans specifically are really high, again, in those phytohemagglutinin or that PHA that I talked about. So that is something to keep in mind, is like, you definitely want to minimize certain foods that are very high in lectins more than others. If you were to eat kidney beans, which are much higher in lectins than probably a walnut, it would make more sense to cut out the kidney beans but maybe still enjoy the walnut. Kidney beans being much higher in the lectin content, you could say, well, we'll cut that out, but we can still enjoy walnuts because they're much less lectin containing in walnuts than they are in kidney beans. So again, kidney beans are really high. So these are something that I usually have people avoid because the PHA from high lectin foods stimulates the immune system. I usually just have anyone with autoimmune or any kind of autoinflammatory condition just cut them out for a bit, just so it doesn't trigger more tissue destruction. If you are looking for an exact breakdown of different lectin containing foods and how they target different tissues like the joints or the thyroid or the gut or the skin, etc., I have a full in-depth article on holisticspring.org membership platform. I will link it in the podcast description so you guys can take a look at it. There's so much insane and incredible and exclusive information on this platform. So I would love for you guys to join. You can cancel at any time. It is so affordable. And the little fee that we do charge is just to cover the maintenance and running of the membership platform. But you guys get full access to me. You can ask me any questions and get full in-depth answers. I have videos on there. We do quizzes. We have free PDF downloads and ebook guides, protocols, forums, chat room, blog, all that good stuff. So there's so much there. But yeah, I have a really great post. It's just a lot to go into in one podcast, but I have a really good post which pretty much takes different lectin containing foods and categorizes it where it like which tissues it directly targets. Again, whether it's the joint, so maybe if you have rheumatoid arthritis, you would want to minimize certain lectin foods that target those joints, certain foods that target the skin, etc. Again, kidney beans fell into almost all the categories, so it's always the top of my list for people to avoid if you are consuming them. But what is the best way to prepare lectin foods? So the best way to lower lectin content is to actually soak the grains and legumes. Now, this is something I tell everyone to do constantly. I feel like a broken record sometimes because I'm always like, soak, soak, soak. But you really should. I know it can be hard if you are trying to make a meal last minute. And in this situation, I always say just buy sprouted. A lot of companies will sell amazing like sprouted quinoa, sprouted buckwheat, and different sprouted grains and legumes so that if you are not able to soak them, they're already soaked and sprouted for you, so it's a lot easier to digest. But if you are not able to access those, just try to plan ahead. Soak your legumes, soak your grains as much as you possibly can before using them. I usually suggest soaking them for 24 to 48 hours, pretty much rinsing every couple hours, like draining, rinsing, and then refilling. And after you're done soaking them and you're ready to cook them, make sure to rinse them really, really well. And a second way to ensure you're making these foods easier to digest is, like I said, to sprout them. So you can sprout them on your own, or you can buy them sprouted already. There are so many tutorials on YouTube on how to sprout grains and legumes. It's super easy, so I won't go into detail on that here, but definitely look into this more if you're interested. Sprouting just helps them release some of the phytic acid content and helps break down the food a little bit more, allowing our body to digest it a lot more easily. And the third thing you want to do after you've soaked and sprouted the food is to cook it on low heat and very slow. Low and slow. You can use a slow cooker to simmer the grains and legumes on your stove for a long time. You can go like 12 hours or more and make them super soft. You can also add seaweed to the pot while cooking the legumes or grains, which will help release more lectins and phytic acid, as it has been shown that iodine from seaweed helps with the release of these toxic compounds. So I always will just throw like a little bit of like kelp. I have like a kelp shaker. It's like an organic kelp flake seasoning, I guess. I just dump that into my cooking pot or whatever, and I add the legumes and then just simmer it with it. You don't taste it at all, but apparently iodine does help release more phytic acid and lectins, so I do it as an extra precaution. Okay, so should we not eat anything that contains lectins? The answer is yes and no. Lectins are present in so many incredible foods that have a wide variety of essential nutrients in them. Approximately 30% of our foods that we consume regularly contain lectins. So if we were to avoid every single food that contains some degree of lectins, we would be extremely limited on our food choices. And we would also become quite deficient in certain essential nutrients, because anytime we remove permanently any kind of food or food groups, we therefore are limiting ourselves to the beautiful nutrients that come with those foods. So depending on your health condition, you may need to avoid certain foods for a certain period of time. For example, again, if you have an autoimmune disease and are currently in a flare, I would typically say avoid all grains and legumes to really reduce your daily lectin consumption and prevent some inflammation. If you have severe leaky gut, you want to avoid most foods that contain lectins for a period of time. So grains, legumes, nuts, seeds. Usually when someone is moving through like a gut protocol with me, I always just have them remove grains. We remove legumes. Sometimes like some buckwheat I'll keep in just so they have some carbs. And buckwheat's very anti-inflammatory, but mostly we remove grains, legumes, and a lot of different nuts as well. But at the end of the day, if you don't have any severe health issues, if you're just like, I'm trying to just improve a couple little things or maintain my health, it's okay to consume foods that contain lectins, especially if you're preparing the foods correctly and not over consuming them. So for example, if you are like, I'm going to throw in the vegan and plant-based diet here, again, not to throw anyone under the bus at all. And like you do you for sure. But I do know that like vegans, plant-based people are eating a lot more lectins. So if you have an autoimmune or you have a gut issue, just be very careful. I will say from experience, because I was vegan for over 6 months, like strictly vegan, assuming it would actually help my gut issues. That's why I went vegan. And I went from having mild IBS to severe full-blown IBD within a matter of like a few weeks, just because I was eating much more foods that contain lectins. I was like eating more legumes for protein and more quinoa and more grains, because obviously I wasn't getting any protein, so I needed to fill up somehow. And I didn't want to eat like fake soy and things like that. So yeah, I was just eating more legumes and things, and it tore up my gut. It really affected me, and I got a lot of deficiencies because I was not absorbing a lot of the nutrients I was eating, like all the salads and the vegetables. I wasn't getting nutrition from because I was always eating it with lectin foods, and so it was minimizing the absorption. So again, not to say not to be vegan or plant-based, but just keep that in mind when you're going through your journey, just understanding what's actually happening in the body when you're eating certain foods. But yeah, like I said, If you don't have any severe health issues, it's okay to consume foods that contain lectins. Just prepare them correctly and don't eat them at like breakfast, lunch, dinner all day, every day. I typically will keep my grains or legumes to one meal, max a day. Typically it'll be my lunch. Like I'll do a quinoa bowl with lots of salad and stuff. And that will be like my max, or maybe like a little bit of oats in the morning, something like that, rather than every single meal. You will hear many health professionals and practitioners saying to avoid all lectin foods, but again, I don't think it is ever healthy to avoid whole food groups permanently unless there's a severe reason why you would need to. Some foods will contain more lectins than others, so if you are looking to reduce lectin consumption, just try cutting out the most lectin-containing foods. That would be your seaweed, or your soybeans, so tofu, your kidney beans, and wheat. And maybe even go a step further and cut out some like almonds and peanuts. But then enjoy your chia seeds, which yes, contain lectins, but enjoy your chia seed pudding. Enjoy a little bit of your walnut milk, or even a little bit of almond butter shouldn't be a huge issue. Again, depending on your health concerns. You could find a list, like I said, on Google, listing the most highest lectin foods to a more moderate or more mild lectin containing food. So just cut out the top group, see how you feel. And if you're still having some issues, then you could start cutting out some of the less intensely concentrated lectin foods and go from there. But don't stress about it. Like I said, it's more about if you're eating it constantly, that's where you want to turn your gaze and say, okay, let's reduce a little bit and see how we feel. And I mean, with my protocols with my clients, always the foods we remove is gluten and dairy are the two top. And then I always say, let's cut out grains. So we're just having like a little bit of buckwheat. I do encourage things like flax and chia, because even though they do contain lectins, you need that soluble fiber, or you can have major colon issues and like even colon cancer if you don't get enough fiber. So I'm always careful with letting people still have the soluble fiber and not stressing about that, because the lectin content in those would be a lot less than, say, again, kidney beans, which I feel like I'm bashing kidney beans. They're delicious. But yeah, definitely something you don't want to be eating too frequently if you're in a flare or if you have any gut issues right now. But that is about it. So I hope this was helpful. I know there's probably so much more information and questions you guys have. And information that you would like. I tried to just keep these podcasts to a smaller duration or shorter duration so that it's not overwhelming. But again, if you guys have any questions on this topic, you can always reach me through my social media. And like I said, my membership platform, holisticspring.org, has forums, so you guys can post any questions you have there and get full in-depth answers from me. And we can just keep chatting back and forth until you're happy and satisfied with the answer you received. So definitely worth it, and definitely would love to have you there, and would love to have you join my community. Sorry, I'm getting so tongue-tied. But yeah, this is definitely a topic that I get questions on a lot. So if you have any questions, reach out. But also, hopefully I did answer a lot of the common questions that some of you might have had, in that lectins can be inflammatory. They can affect us negatively. They can cause us to flare. They can irritate the gut. So let's remove some of the top lectin foods, which mainly are beans and grains. And then start by doing that. And you should feel better by just cutting those foods out and then enjoying other foods. Even if they have lectins, don't stress, as long as you've cut out some of the big ones. And then you can slowly reintroduce as you feel better. And if you don't really feel better, then you can go a little bit more and cut out some more of lectin foods that might still be in your diet. But it's not something I ever want people to cut out 100%. So it's always like you cut it out for a period of time, whatever that period of time is for you. It could be a couple weeks, a couple months, it could be a year. Depends on, how serious your health issues are. But once you have gotten into remission, you have improved your symptoms and your health, then I'd say bring them back. And you should be able to tolerate them here or there. I definitely can't do like beans every day, but I could definitely like have a great chili once a week and feel great, and at the same time still have some grains here and there. But if I'm eating rice every day, beans every day, and all the other lectin foods and nuts and stuff constantly, of course I would have some irritation. So just like I think everything is so important, and I always say, everything in moderation. That's how I want you guys to kind of take this information, is just pick a couple lectin foods, remove them, enjoy everything in moderation. It should be manageable from there. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you have a beautiful day or night wherever you are listening from. I really appreciate the listen, and I will talk to you in the next episode.